Hello, boys and girls. Welcome back for our very last read aloud. The year is almost over, and I have enjoyed so much making these videos for you to watch at home. I hope you've been enjoying them as well. We have one more story to read, and it's actually a traditional story or a folklore. Um, and before we do that, we're going to do what we always do and review our vocabulary in case we see them in our story. We'll know what they mean. So the first one is search. It is fun to search for buried treasure. You never know what you will find. So if you are searching for something, that means you are looking for something. Number two is contained. This old box contained jewels, coins, and other treasures. So contain means that you have or you're holding something inside of something else. So your backpack may contain, it may hold your books and your pencils. Your dresser at your house may contain clothes. So it's just what's inside. Number three is startled. The diver was startled to find treasure at the bottom of the ocean. So if you are startled, that means you're kind of shocked, you're surprised, you were not expecting something. So you might be startled if somebody jumps out in front of you and scares you, or you could be startled if you weren't expecting a dog to jump out in front of you. Any of those things, you could be shocked or surprised. You are startled. Number four is odd. Do you think it is odd or strange to look for buried treasure? So if something is odd, it means it's a little bit strange, a little weird, a little bit different. Number five is leaned. The woman leaned over to get a better view of the whale near the ship. So if you're leaning, that means you're kind of going one way, or you're leaning over, you're trying to see something a little bit better, and you are tilting or leaning your body. Number six is tossed. They tossed the supplies into the trunk to pack for their vacation. So if you toss something, if somebody says, toss me the ball, you're kind of throwing it lightly. You aren't chucking it at somebody really fast. If you toss something, you're just kind of letting it throw a little bit softly. Number seven is grateful. The museum was very grateful or thankful to get the old statues. So if you're grateful or thankful for something, you might be grateful for your mom and your dad because they do things for you. You might be grateful for your presents that you get for your birthday or for Christmas. And finally, our last one is village. This village is near the ocean. People find coins buried on the beach. So a village is kind of like a small town. It's smaller than a city, and it's usually pretty small, and people have different businesses there, but it's called a village. So think of it like a tiny town. So when I look at the vocabulary, I'm noticing a lot of mention of treasures and being by the water and different towns where people are finding things. So I wonder if I'm predicting if this story is going to have something to do with treasure. We'll have to see and find out. Okay, we're going to preview our topic, but before we do that, we're going to look at our target skill and our target strategy. So remember, we look at these skills so we kind of know what to think about while we're reading. And for this week, we're talking about characters. So as we're reading, as our strategy, we want to stop at every couple of pages and really think if we know what's going on, if we're comprehending, if we're understanding the story. Because remember, while you're reading, you have to remember all the parts so that you can truly understand what's going on. If we're not really absorbing that information and we're kind of confused about what's happening, then we may need to go back and reread it so that our brain knows and follows the story correctly. When we're talking about our characters, remember the characters are the people that we meet or the animals that we meet in a story. So for this target skill, we're going to try to understand the characters. So that's looking at their feelings and their emotions and their actions, what they're doing in the story. And we're going to use clues and text evidence to figure out how we feel about these characters at the beginning of the story. And maybe if anything that happens in the story changes those characters. So think about that as we're reading. Are we understanding what's going on and what's happening to the characters? How do we feel about those characters? So, like I said before, this type of story is a traditional story, and these kind of stories are told for a long time and they get retold. So, people tell those stories over and over and over again. Some people like to write them down so they can remember them, and sometimes they're told in different countries and they might be tweaked a little bit. But most of the time, it has magic and it might even have talking animals, things that might not happen in real life. But most of the time, somebody or something learns a lesson. It learns something that helps them in life. It teaches them something important that they can remember for a long time. So you may have read some traditional tales in the past, like Little Red Riding Hood or Jack and the Beanstalk. And so those are some things where things might not happen, like wolves don't really talk, and there aren't magic beanstalks with giants at the top. But most of the time, they end on a good note. Usually the good triumphs over evil, but sometimes some bad things happen too. So I wonder if that's going to happen in our story. When we look at the title, it's called Two of Everything. So that makes me think, I wonder what's going to happen in this story. Why does it mean two of everything? We'll have to see. Our author's name is Lily Toy Hong, and she's also the illustrator. So she wrote the words and she also drew the pictures. And she is from China, but I don't think she's ever been, but she'd really like to learn more about those folk tales and read actually in China. So that'd be pretty cool. So she decided to create this story for us, and hopefully we can learn a lesson. We can use that text evidence, ask some questions, make sure we're comprehending the story so that we can figure out what our two characters learn. Now, before we start reading, remember we always look at our essential questions, so it helps guide us to figure out what the story is really about. So it says, what good things happen when people work together? So we don't only have to talk about that in our story. Sometimes our essential questions apply to our own lives. So just think about some things that might be a little bit easier, or things that turn out really good when you work with a partner. You get help from other people and you work together as a team. So I'm thinking that when I have a problem and I'm thinking about it and it's really, really hard for me to find a solution, sometimes I like to talk to other people and get their opinions, and talk to my friends or my family and help us come up with a solution. And so when we work together, most of the time I can solve my problem. I wonder what's going to happen to our two characters where they need to work together to solve a problem. Let's read and find out. Remember, when we read these together on the computer, you can always mute Miss Owen and practice your fluency, but for now we're going to jump in and read together. Once long ago, in a humble little hut, lived Mr. Hucktalk and his wife, Mrs. Hucktalk. They were old and very poor. What little they ate came from their tiny garden. In a lucky year, when the harvest was plentiful, Mr. Hucktalk had a little extra to take to the village. There he traded turnips, potatoes, and other vegetables for clothing, lamp oil, and fresh seeds. Okay, so we have our two characters, Mr. and Mrs. Hucktalk. They are married and they're very old and they're very poor. So remember, if you're very poor, that means you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of things to live off of. But if we look at what the text has already told us, it says that they garden, they have a garden, they plant their own food, and when they have extra, they take it to the village, that tiny little town or like little city, to trade for different things. So what do you think about these characters? What do you think about Mr. and Mrs. Hucktalk? Do you think that they are kind? Do you think that they're lazy? Do you think that they're hardworking? Do you think that they're mean? What do you think about our characters right now at the beginning of the story? I think that they're probably hardworking. They don't have a lot of money. They work really hard to make sure they have food on the table. They live off of just a little bit. They're not rich. They don't have a bunch of money, and they work really hard to get the things that they need. So it sounds like they're two really good characters right now. One spring morning, when Mr. Hucktuck was digging in his garden, his shovel struck something hard. Puzzled, he dug deeper into the dark ground until he came upon an ancient pot made of brass. "How odd," said Mr. Hucktuck to himself. "To think that I've been digging here all these years and never came upon this pot before. I will take it home. Maybe Mrs. Hucktuck can find some use for it." So what did Mr. Hucktuck find? An ancient pot made of brass. So if something's ancient, that means that it's really old, and it's a big pot made of brass. So it's kind of like a brown gold color. And he's really confused about this pot. Why is he so confused when he finds it while he's digging? He's confused because he's never seen it before. He's had this land and he's been gardening for years and years, and he's never found this pot in the ground before. So maybe this pot has a little bit of magic in it, or somebody put it there. I don't know. We'll have to read on to find it. But his plan was to take it home to his wife and see if she can find something for them to use with that pot. The pot was big and heavy for old Mr. Hucktuck. As he stumbled along, his purse, which contained his last 5 gold coins, fell to the ground. He tossed it into the pot for safekeeping and staggered home. His wife greeted him at the door. "Dear husband, what a strange pot!" Mr. Hucktuck explained how he found the pot. "I wonder what we can do with it," said Mrs. Hucktuck. "It looks too large to cook in and too small to bathe in." So remember, Mr. and Mrs. Hucktuck are very old, and so this pot is really big and really heavy. So as Mr. Hucktuck is carrying it, he's wobbly, he's staggering. It's really hard for him to walk because he's so old. And his little purse with his money in it falls on the ground. So he picks it up and he throws it into the pot so that he doesn't lose it, and brings it home to his wife. And now they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with this pot. As Mrs. Hucktuck leaned over to peer into the pot, her hairpin, the only one she owned, fell in. She felt around in the pot, and suddenly her eyes grew round with surprise. "Look!" she shouted. "I've pulled out 2 hairpins exactly alike, and 2 purses too." Sure enough, the purses were identical, and so were the hairpins. Inside each purse were 5 gold coins. So they have this big pot that seems to have a little bit of magic. Mr. Hucktuck put his purse with his money in it, and Mrs. Hucktuck had a hairpin that fell into it. They only had 1 purse and 1 hairpin, but when they pulled it out of the magic pot, now there are 2 hairpins and 2 purses. So that means they have more money now. Sounds pretty cool to me. Mr. Hucktuck was so excited he jumped up and down. "Let's put my winter coat inside the pot. If we are lucky again, the pot will make 2 coats, and then we will both stay warm." So into the pot went 1 coat, and out came 2 coats. They began to search the house and quickly put more things into the magical pot. "If only we had some meat," wished Mr. Hucktuck, "or fresh fruit, or 1 delicious sweet cake." So what's happening when they put things into the magic pot? What's happening to their things around their house? They're doubling, they're getting more, and things look exactly the same. So it's making a copy or a clone of things that they already have. So because Mr. Hawk and Mrs. Hawk are very poor, they're not used to having lots of money or enough winter coats for both of them or enough food. So I think they're getting pretty excited that this magical pot is giving them double the amount of things that they put inside of it. Mr. Hawk smiled. I know how we can get anything we want, she said. She put their 10 coins into one purse, then threw it into the pot. She pulled out 2 purses with 10 coins in each. What a clever wife I have, cried Mr. Hawk. Each time we do this, we will have twice as much money as before. The Hawks worked late into the night, filling and emptying the pot until the floor was covered with coins. So Mr. Hawk said that Mrs. Hawk, his wife, was very clever or very smart. Why do you think that Mrs. Hawk was clever or smart? Why do you think that? I think that she was pretty smart because she was finding out ways to get more money. Remember, they don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of things. So when she figured out that the pot makes double, makes twice as much, she was thinking, if we have 10 coins and I put it in the pot, I'm going to get double that. So 10 plus 10 is 20. And then she can double the 20. 20 plus 20 is 40. Then she could put the 40 in there. 40 plus 40 is 80. So they're getting more and more coins, more and more money that they're not used to having. I would say she is pretty smart for thinking about that. But I'm hoping that nothing bad happens because she's kind of getting this money, not in a sneaky way, but she's finding money that she doesn't normally have. So hopefully nothing bad happens to the Hawks. Morning came, and off went Mr. Hawk with a long list of things to buy in the village. Instead of vegetables, his basket was full of gold coins. Mrs. Hawk finished all of her chores and sat down to enjoy a cup of tea. She sipped her tea and admired the brass pot. Then, with a grateful heart, she knelt and embraced it. Dear pot, I do not know where you came from, but you are my best friend. She stooped over the pot to look inside. So at the beginning of the story, Mr. and Mrs. Hawk were very hardworking, they were very kind, and they lived with little means. They didn't have a lot to live off of, so they worked really hard to have what they did. And now they're getting all of these things, and she's feeling very grateful. She's thanking the pot for giving her all of these things that she's never had. At that very moment, Mr. Hawk returned. His arms were so full of packages that he had to kick the door open. Bang! Mrs. Hawk was so startled that she lost her balance and fell head first into the pot. Mr. Hawk ran over and grabbed his wife's legs. He pulled and tugged until she slid out onto the floor. But when he looked at the pot again, he gasped. 2 more legs were sticking straight out of it. Naturally, he took hold of the ankles and pulled. Out came a second person. She looked exactly like his wife. Uh-oh. What happened to Mrs. Hawk? The magic pot made 2 of her. Remember, if 1 goes in, 2 comes out. So now there are 2 Mrs. Hawks. Oh my goodness. The new Mrs. Hawk sat silently on the floor, looking lost. But the first Mrs. Hawk cried, I am your one and only wife. Put that woman back in the pot right now. Mr. Hawk Talk yelled, No! If I put her back, we will not have 2 women, but 3. 1 wife is enough for me. He backed away from his angry wife and tripped and fell head first into the pot himself. Oh my goodness. So, Mrs. Hawk Talk is feeling a little bit jealous because now there are 2 of her. And she's telling Mr. Hawk Talk, you better put her back in that magic pot. We don't need 2 of us. We just need 1. But he was really smart. He was thinking, if I put her in that pot, it's just going to make another one, and we don't want that. But then what happened to Mr. Hawk Talk? He fell in the pot too. Oh my goodness. This is crazy. Both Mrs. Hawk Talks rushed to rescue him. Each grasped an ankle, and together they pulled him out. There were 2 more legs in the pot, so they pulled out the other Mr. Hawk Talk too. Just what use does one Mr. Hawk Talk have for another? Mr. Hawk Talk cried angrily. This pot is not as wonderful as we thought it to be. Now even our troubles are beginning to double. But his wife had been thinking while he was yelling. So, how is Mr. Hawk Talk feeling? He's feeling a little bit angry. Now there's 2 of him and 2 of her, and he's getting a little bit frustrated because now the pot is causing a little bit of trouble. But Miss Hawk Talk is thinking she must be coming up with a solution. Let's see what she figures out. Calm down, she said. It is good that the other Mrs. Hawk Talk has her own Mr. Hawk Talk. Perhaps we will become best of friends. After all, we are so alike. He will be a brother to you, and she a sister to me. With our pot, we can make 2 of everything, so there will be plenty to go around. So now there are 2 Mr. and Mrs. Hawk Talks, and they're being really smart by using their magic pot to make 2 of everything. That must be where our title came from. And that is what they did. The Hawk Talks built 2 fine new homes. Each house had identical teapots, rice bowls, silk embroideries, and bamboo furniture. From the outside, the houses looked exactly alike, but there was one difference. Hidden in one house was a big brass pot. Of course, the Hawk Talks were always very careful not to fall into it again. So they made 2 identical houses. Everything looks the same, but probably the original Hawk Talks kept the magical brass pot. The new Hawk Talks and the old Hawk Talks did become good friends. The neighbors thought that the Hawk Talks had grown so rich that they decided to have 2 of everything, even themselves. So that was a pretty crazy story, boys and girls, about the Hawk Talks and their magic brass pot and how it can double anything that you put inside. I think when they worked together, the couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hawk Talk, were working together to try to find a solution to their problem. And they learned that they have to be really careful not to fall in that magic pot, or they're just going to keep doubling and duplicating everything. But it seemed like they were being pretty smart with their solutions, even though it caused them a little bit of trouble. But I thought that folktale was pretty interesting because we wouldn't really find a magical pot, even though that would be super cool. And as our extension activity today, I want you to think about that and draw me a picture of what your magical pot would look like. And I want you to think of 3 things that you would put inside your pot with the hopes of it doubling. So I want you to draw me a picture of your pot and 3 things that you would want more of. It could be money, it could be clothes, it might be another brother or sister, it might be a pet, it could be anything that you want. And then write me a story about why or what happens to all of your things, or if you break your pot, or if it doubles way too much and it starts to be crazy. So write me a silly story, or write me some reasons as to why you chose those 3 objects as your writing and drawing extension activity. And I will see you later, boys and girls, with a new story if we get a bonus video. If not, have a great summer, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.